Okay, guys, it's 9:02. Let's crack on. So, welcome to Back to the Future Wednesdays. Delighted to have a great setup or a great bunch of people with me on the call today. We will be running through, Matt, next slide, please, the agenda. So, today we're going to talk about the evolution of sandboxing, which kind of builds on the evolution of IPS that we ran through last week. The two technologies are very, very similar in terms of how they operate, but they do very different things. So Matt Smith, our resident consulting engineer, malware expert, will be running us through how Sandbox have evolved, or how anti-malware actually has evolved, and how we got to sandboxing and some of the tools and techniques that we need to deploy in order to be successful in stopping cyber attacks now and in the future. As ever, ask questions. We have a great panel of people who you can challenge. They love to be challenged. They love hard questions. They'd like to be put on the spot. And if we don't know, we will go away and we will find out. So yeah, please use the Q&A panel to ask any questions. Use the chat function to interact with the team and interact with the call. And of course, there are reactions. So if you want to put a thumbs up, hands up, then please do. And if you want to put a thumbs down, I'll be intrigued to know why. So as ever, we're going to run a quiz. So hopefully this quiz will be a bit more successful than the last one. But practice makes perfect. I think we'll get it this week. I'm really hopeful. These are the quiz instructions. The quiz is not yet open, but if you want to scan that QR code, you can load up Menti on your phone and get ready for the quiz at the end of the call. There are prizes for the quiz winners. The top 3 people get prizes, and they should be notified, or should be being notified as we speak. So there should be some emails coming out to you, and I'll show you a sample email later in the call, so you know that it's not phishing and what to expect if you're in the top 3. So without further ado, let us crack on and let's get into the past, present, and future of sandboxing. Over to you, Matt.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning as we kind of delve into the history as to why this technology became a thing, how it was leveraged, and how it's being leveraged in today's world, and how that has changed over time and how we've got there. So without much further ado, we have to kind of think about, well, why did it need to exist in the first place? And what we have to do is cast our mind back all the way back to the Windows XP era, when, you know, the average desktop and workstation system kind of looked a little bit like this. Software was much simpler, administration was much simpler. Just the world in general, it seems, was a lot simpler and a lot easier to navigate. And at that time, endpoint software, you know, in terms of what was out there from a defense standpoint, you know, whether it be, you know, antivirus, anti-malware, etc., kind of looked like this. And more often than not, the same stuff that you could buy from your local big box retailer was the same stuff that was being deployed in the enterprise. You know, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between them. And they operated on 2 very, very similar principles, and 2 very, very core principles. One being they were often defined by signatures. And as we now know in today's world, signatures aren't wholly effective at capturing certain, you know, attacks, certain techniques. You know, signatures are very, very slow to update. There is a training and a validation process that has to happen before they make their way into the world. And of course, as we now know, as malware has evolved, often signatures are rendered useless in a matter of minutes. And the second approach that they kind of took was this notion of having each and every hash on a allow or deny list, which arguably worked in the very, very early days. But as time kind of progressed, what we found was, you know, as a particular malware sample or a chain or, you know, a campaign would often evolve, obviously that involves a new hash. And if that hash wasn't known to these security vendors and these types of technologies, then they didn't really do anything about it, you know, because more often than not, there wouldn't be a signature match. There wouldn't be a hash match. That malware campaign and that sample would often be smart enough to evade these specific types of, you know, endpoint security technologies that existed, because it was aware of maybe what honeypots and what traps have been laid. So if it accessed, say, a certain file, then it knew that there was something malicious afoot. So there's all these types of, you know, different techniques that rendered these technologies absolutely useless. And that issue became compounded when this idea of this advanced persistent threat kind of came into existence. And when APTs, as they become known, started to gain a lot of mindshare and a lot of traction, it only ever highlighted that the technologies that we had both at the endpoint and at the network layer weren't wholly sufficient to deal with this extremely malleable, this extremely versatile new breed of malware that was coming into the average organization. And what we then saw as well at the same time was obviously that the attackers were changing their methodology. They were changing their techniques as to getting those campaigns, those samples on a running system. And here's just one easy example. And it's a very, very trivial example in the grand scheme of things where, you know, we've all seen it. Some of us might even know someone who's fallen victim to it, where something simple as a phishing email, there is a link to a trusted site, maybe something like OneDrive. That user downloads a macro-enabled Word document. That macro goes and grabs a secondary payload, and it runs that against the system. And now that is running entirely in memory, completely outside of the purview of these older endpoint technologies. And certainly the network layer at the time, there wasn't really much to deal with this, you know, that identification of a brand new sample that's never been seen before. Because again, no hash match, no signature match. What can you do? And this technique has been with us for the best part of 20 years, and it hasn't really changed much. Certain bits of the puzzle have maybe taken on new shapes and sizes, but fundamentally the puzzle still fits together the same way it's always done. So when we then think about this on a more macro scale, well, how does this really look? You know, because we talk about malware being malleable, we talk about it evading signatures and evading hash maps and stuff like that. Well, here is some information that we pulled from our data set, which was we took a particular campaign and we looked at the initial impact, or the patient zero, and then we looked at 5 minutes, 15 minutes, and 30 minutes later. How many confirmed detections could we find inside that 30-minute window? And as you can see, you know, that number doesn't scale linearly. You know, it's rising on an exponential curve. And what we found was when we started looking into this data, you know, a bit more, is that this is not the same sample. This is variations of that original sample. So if you're a security vendor and you're basing your technology off signatures and hash lists, well, now suddenly within 30 minutes, your single signature, your single hash list now has to encompass up to, you know, 45,000 and a half, you know, so entries using this example, right? So it's an unwinnable war. It's an approach that doesn't really work and doesn't really scale anymore. And, you know, to make matters even worse, a lot of malware today is a lot smarter than what it was when we go back, you know, a handful of years. And a lot of these techniques are all, you know, come from the approach that originally happened where, as I said, you know, a lot of endpoint technologies and a lot of network technologies would lay traps, right? They would have maybe dummy files on the file system. They would have, you know, certain honeypot-like services that they would anticipate, you know, these malware samples to reach out to. And that's how they would do some of their detection. Well, when the malware authors realized that this was happening and they started to develop their campaigns to avoid those techniques, or even to flip them around and weaponize them against the system, what they then discovered was that actually they can go a step further. Identifying where you've landed and what you can do once you've landed is an incredibly powerful stage in a typical attack lifecycle. So what the malware authors did was they started to develop in a lot of checks and a lot of kind of awareness into their software, which inadvertently has enabled them in today's world to evade a lot of commodity sandboxes that exist in the wild. So, you know, here's just some of them, for example, where, you know, they'll be looking for the presence of things like debuggers. You know, a very, very common, easy, low-hanging fruit opportunity for them. It's something that every sandbox will have to a degree. So if you can find that, then you know you're running with a microscope looking at you. Okay, so then you can exit out and you can not give the defenders, you know, or the security vendors the ability to inspect further, right? And that's gotten more and more intense as time's gone on. We're starting to look for things, we've seen examples where malware is trying to probe system information for things like temperature data, for things like what screen resolution the user's running at, how many clicks the mouse is inputted into the system since the system booted, right? All of these things are kind of good indicators of whether or not you're running on a real workstation or if you're running on a virtualized analysis environment. And that goes even further, it's part of their, endless drive to remain hidden, because remember, the first goal of malware is to run. It's not necessarily to do anything, it's just to run. A lot of obfuscation techniques have been developed, above and beyond the typical, okay, well, we can just compress and we can run, some custom, string manipulation to fool those signature-based detection mechanisms. But also we've seen entire utilities get built. One of the more common ones is this thing called packers, or packing utilities. And one of the more famous ones is a tool called UPX, for example. And what UPX does is it essentially takes your program and chunks it up into different sectors and then implements an algorithm that can then reorganize and decompress those sectors at runtime. So when you come along and you do a static analysis of that file, there's nothing in there that you can use to build a viable signature against. It's completely obfuscated, and it's a real nightmare to deal with. And of course, it's because of the way that these utilities work. Simply changing a single bit will result in a brand new hash. Therefore, the hash-based approach doesn't work anymore. And then we get into probably the more recent development. And I say recent, we're talking last 5-10 years or so, which is exclusively running in memory, for the simple reason that most endpoint technologies rely on something touching a drive inside a system to do something. There are certain triggers that an operating system will expose, things like disk on write or file read, etc. And those technologies can only do something when those trigger conditions are met. Now, if you can get your software to run entirely inside memory, ideally using an existing, legitimate, trusted process, something like Microsoft Office or a browser or some a system level service, then you have better permissions, so you can do more things to that system. You will have access to everything that application has, and if it's vulnerable and you can overflow it, obviously access to many, many more things. And it means a lot of these technologies can't see what's happening inside memory. They can't see what your malicious application is doing, because as far as they're concerned, Office is a trusted application. It's not doing anything strange. It's not writing data to the disk. Everything is fine. When actually, in reality, many, many bad things are happening. And that's kind of led us to where we are today. Sandboxes were born out of a need to completely change the way that we inspect unknown, potentially zero-day files and samples. And that was born out of a need because existing endpoint technologies simply were not good enough. They were not capable of doing that analysis on a performant time scale, doing it at any reasonable scale, or having the complexity to test for every possible vector and to try and figure out, is there something interesting here? Because nobody wants to expose a potential piece of malware to their corporate network or a home network, give it a free reign internet connection and see what happens. No one really wants to do that. And therefore, the first generation of sandboxes were born. And then over time, those sandboxes have worked their way into other bits of the environment. So Palo Alto Networks, for example, we have Wildfire, which we're going to look at in a little bit more detail in a second. And, that sits across network, endpoint, cloud, everywhere. Whereas most of the market is still focused on one very particular thing, whether that be endpoint or network, not both. And modern malware has kind of ended up in one of these two boxes here, which is they are definitely aware of the environment they're running in. And it's probably more uncommon these days to find a piece of malware that doesn't perform any kind of checks to figure out if it is running inside a sandbox, or if it is being poked and prodded at to try and get something to happen. And then most malware these days will try and run in entirely inside system memory, rather than trying to avoid, trying to leave information, as we call them here, artifacts behind that can be used for, forensics, for attribution, for, targeting of campaigns, all of that stuff. Malware has one very, very simple goal when it hits a system, and that's to run. Okay. Everything that comes after that is really a bonus. If you can get it to run, then you can worry about being clean and being, hiding in plain sight on a system and avoiding whatever technologies are on there. But getting to the point of running is the most critical bit here. And of course, as we look over time, and we're looking at our sample data here, this is what we're ingesting into Wildfire, on a per year basis here. And what is quite clear to us is that it's not necessarily a linear curve. Obviously this is normalized quite aggressively, but if we were to show you, the real, break it down per 24 hours data, it is incredibly lumpy. And, we can spot some macro trends, like, for example, around common public holidays, we often see that the number of, samples being submitted to us are significantly lower, for example. You might think, well, do the adversaries take holidays? And the answer is yes, they do. And we also find, the obvious that if there's no one around working and using these corporate machines, then there isn't any, samples being downloaded or submitted to us in those cases. But as you can see, in more recent years, since kind of 2020 onwards, that has been aggressively scaling upwards. And, we're currently on the region of about 3.5 billion unique samples a month that come in to us for inspection and that secondary analysis and that verdict. Okay, so it's not a small number, and that number is aggressively growing. We anticipate that to be somewhere around the 4 to 4.5 billion mark by kind of the close of this year. So it's remarkable how far this has gone. So let's talk about the solution. How do we start addressing these problems? Because we've got Sandboxes being born out of a need of endpoint and network technologies not being sophisticated or good enough to deal with completely unknown files. Then when Sandboxes were born and they started to be leveraged, the malware authors became incredibly aware of these technologies and how they worked. And very, very quickly, they figured out how to defeat them, and defeat them with relative ease. And sometimes that can just simply be overwhelming them, by completely submitting thousands upon thousands of samples and clogging up that analysis pipeline. It could be, figuring out if you're running inside an analysis environment. It could be using some brand new obfuscation technique or some new packing technique. It could be you split up your campaign into to many, many stages, and you simply wait out the sandbox. It has a finite time to come to a conclusion. And if you can wait that out, well, it will never see the true intent of your attack. So there's lots of ways to defeat these sandboxing technologies. And more often than not, a lot of them are not very well integrated. So we talk about, okay, you send data to it, it provides you a response back. What do you do with that response? How do you get information out of it that can actually be useful in providing, context, IOC data, artifact data, maybe even cleanup data to go looking for that file in the environment and go and clean it up, right? All of these things are incredibly challenging to achieve in the real world. So how do we go about solve that? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to build an approach where all the data we send to that environment has to be leveraged by every other capability that we have in our organization. Okay, so we send that sample, in this case to Wildfire, which is our sandboxing environment, if you like. Wildfire detonates that file, performs analysis, it detonates it, analyzes what is this thing trying to do, And how does it do it? At the end of that analysis, it will produce a set of IOC data or indicators of compromise. And they will be everything from URLs, domains, IP addresses, the file activity data, all the processing data about what it did to that system. And we take all that information. And as an organization, as a consumer, obviously we want to be able to leverage that everywhere, right? So I can push that data into every other service. And that's what we do natively. If we see a URL IOC, we take it and give it to our URL service. Our URL service then goes and validates what the sandbox has said to it. That says, if the sandbox says this is malicious, we go and validate it a second time. Okay. We then take that sample and we produce that, we turn it into a set of signatures and a set of learning that goes and trains all the other environments to look for this particular sample again and variants of it. Okay. And we do that across, firewall, across SASE platforms, in the cloud at the endpoint, and of course, through the API. So if you want to go and extend this to a custom internal application you have, you can do that. We've got quite a few organizations now who have Wildfire as part of their application lifecycle. And that could be something as simple as your application takes a user input, and that user input is a file, it's a binary, it's something that can be executed. Well, you can have Wildfire embedded inside that application through its API, so that when that file is uploaded by the user, it goes to Wildfire for analysis and inspection, and it will return either a malicious or a benign verdict. If it's malicious, then your application goes and quarantines that and deletes that file. And if it's benign, it's allowed to carry on with the business logic and the workflow. And this runs everywhere. And then the second thing we need to do is obviously we need to massively up the catchment that we have, right? More data is more better, as some people will call it. And that's why, we have something to the tune of now 85,000, I think it's even more than that now, unique organizations around the world, all submitting, files to us on a daily basis. And that contributes up to that 3.5 billion samples a month, right? Because the more we're able to see of the world, the more diverse coverage we can get, the better we can build the response, and the better we can deliver, those protection mechanisms out to organizations. So how does this kind of work? So we have down at the bottom here, all of those input sources, whether they're firewalls, whether they're, 3 and 4 letter intelligence agencies, whether they're our partners, whether it's endpoints, firewalls, doesn't matter, right? Something somehow delivers a sample to us, and that could be, there's a full list later on, but there could be, Windows executables, it could be Office documents, it could be, JavaScript from a website, for example. Okay, we bring that in and we perform a pipeline of very unique and very, very different checks. So the first one being the static analysis pass. Okay, and we'll come into this a bit more. Then we move to a dynamic environment. Okay, and then more recently, where we've launched some new capabilities, we then pass it to a secondary environment where we can do some more interesting, more bleeding edge stuff. And then as I said, the net output of that analysis is we identify, okay, we found something malicious or we found something benign. Here is all of those IOCs. Here's all of those artifacts. Here's all of those interesting things that we found that we can now publish to the world. And whether that's published back internally to make our own services better, or whether that's published externally in the form of threat intelligence for the greater community. All of these things are published in more or less real time. And then perhaps the most important thing here is we need to have that complete end-to-end coverage. Okay, so we need to have coverage for every major operating system that exists out there. Whether it's Windows running on workstations or in the server side in the data center, whether it's Mac OS, for example, running on workstations, Linux in the data center, Linux on the desktop, and then of course Android as well. Android is one of those operating systems where it's incredibly prevalent. A lot of IoT devices run it, for example, and Android is, from a sample set of data that we see, Android is more often than not one of the more toxic environments, and we'll talk about what toxic means in a little bit, but it's one of the more toxic environments that we see for malware. Then we need to have comprehensive file type coverage. So we need to be able to pick out, for example, links with inside emails, because we don't know if it's a phishing attack or not. So we take that link, we go follow it, and we go see what's at the end of that trail. Yeah, we need to be able to then look for all of those different binaries and executables that can run on those operating systems, figure out what they're doing. Are they trying to do anything suspicious, anything different? And then we have to start looking at, well, what does the user then interact with? You know, Adobe Flash for a long period of time was a terrific source of malware, but has since kind of fallen out of favor. However, Flash is making a comeback, believe it or not, in terms of toxicity and the amount of malware we're seeing leveraging it. There are now wrapper programs, either in browsers or native to the operating system, that can take a legacy Flash file, reinterpret it as something more modern, and then run that. Okay, so Flash is preserved going forward, but we're now starting to see that those pieces of software are now being leveraged for malware delivery and distribution. Then we talk about things like Microsoft Office and PDFs. We've all seen the horror stories of a user receives an Excel document, it's got a macro in it, they enable the macro, and then Excel closes. Well, the user doesn't think anything weird has happened, but actually they've just been compromised, okay, because of what that macro is able to do in pulling down secondary payload and executing it with Excel's permissions and within Excel's memory space. And then we need to think, well, in the modern world, things are changing. The proliferation of SaaS applications, the fact we're now seeing things like, JavaScript, scripts in general, things like PowerShell, Python, etc., be more commonplace. How do we deal with those? Because malware authors are now at a stage of leveraging operating system standard tooling, standard utilities to run malicious campaigns. We could create a PowerShell script that works the same way as any ransomware sample does. But because it's a PowerShell script, the operating system will inherently trust it. It's very, very difficult to teach a machine or teach any endpoint technology that that PowerShell script is malicious, when at the same time there'll be another PowerShell script that runs that maybe does something mundane, like map drive shares or something like that. And then, of course, as the eternal game of cat and mouse continues, we're starting to see, obviously images be leveraged more and more and more, because images are everywhere. Everything can more or less process them. And, we're now starting to see malware being delivered, embedded inside an image that is then reconstructed and executed on the workstation or on the server. Okay. So there's some incredibly interesting techniques that the malware authors are now starting to leverage, and we have to be able to deal with that. And we have to be able to deal with that at, rapid speed. So when, for example, we first launched into the market, we were operating on the basis of 24 hours. We would collect data over the day, analyze it, and at the end of the 24-hour period, we would push all of that intelligence and all of those signatures back to the market. Well, that was obviously way too slow. So over time, we've been massively improving that. So we went from 24 hours to an hour, then down to 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and now in real time. So as soon as that analysis is concluded, all of that data is made available to you and to every other customer and organization around the globe, okay, in real time, which is something that is truly unique and is really the only way that you kind of start to deal with that volume, right? As malware becomes, more malleable, polymorphism, which is the ability for malware to change over time, starts to really take effect once again, we need to be able to deal with that at massive scale. Okay. So there's only really, really one way to do this, which is to leverage machine learning, but not in the traditional way. So if we think about it, signatures are typically written by hand, or they're developed as an output from some machine process. Now, pattern matching is great. It can be very fast. It can be very, very accurate, but it's often not. It's often very, very slow because the amount of signatures balloons astronomically. If we were to produce an AV signature for every single sample we see, there is no mechanism on Earth that can deal with having 3.5 billion signatures a month get pushed to an endpoint or get pushed to a firewall. Okay, it's just not feasible to do that. And even if you distill them down and you start grouping them together and you find, similar signatures and you find, commonalities, and you can reduce that number, you're still working on the millions scale, right? It's an astronomical number to deal with. So we have to use some form of machine learning. Now, most traditional machine learning has a human element to its equation, which is a human sits down and defines the things that we want the machine to go looking for. And then we use the machine to go scale it up and to do that analysis that we simply wouldn't be able to do ourselves. And this works to a point. But again, the problem is speed. It takes a very long time for a human to sit down and define the things we want it to look for. And as you have brand new techniques, brand new methodologies, brand new ways of obfuscating samples, a human's got to discover that first. Then they've got to sit down and write those rules, then teach the machine how to do it at scale. And that takes quite a lot of time. You're at best talking weeks, and at worst, you're talking months. So that clearly doesn't work. So how do we solve that problem? And we solve that problem by using a very specific discipline of machine learning called deep learning, or neural networks, as you might also heard it. It's the same approach that's used in technologies such as ChatGPT, for example. It's the same discipline of machine learning that's used for computer vision. Why? Because this approach lends itself incredibly well to two things. The first thing is that it can identify what it finds interesting on its own, and it can then use that to teach itself about what is good, what is bad. There's different mechanisms to do that. So each generation that iterates over 24 hours is smarter than the one that came before it. And the second thing that they're really, really good for is they can deal with extreme randomness and variability to the data we feed it. Okay, traditional machine learning requires a very strict set of inputs, whereas the neural network or the deep learning approach, you can just chuck data at it and it will figure it out if it's A, relevant, and B, if it is relevant, what it can then do with it. Okay, so it's an incredibly powerful discipline, and it's something that we've started to use over the last couple of years, and it's something that we're going to continue to use and develop on going forward, because the applications for this are truly limitless in what we want to do. So how does this work in real terms? So we have our input sources in the top left there. In this case, we're just going to use a firewall as an example. We have that sample traverses that platform, and we perform a check. That check asks a very simple question: have we seen this before, yes or no? And if we haven't seen it before, the operator or the administrator of that platform, you define a policy that says, okay, forward it to wildfire. Okay, and then obviously there's something to the tune of 10 to 12 regions around the world. So for example, if you're in Germany, there's a German cloud. If you're in the UK, there's a UK cloud. If you're in Asia, there's obviously regions out there, whether it's Singapore, Japan, etc. So if you've got compliance and regulatory needs, there is a solution for that. But that file is sent to wildfire, and when we get it, we perform a very quick static analysis pass. What this pass does is it looks at the file and it performs a machine learning derived pass upon it, and it's looking for it's trying to answer one very specific question: have we seen anything like it before? Because if we have seen something like it before, then we know it to be malicious or know it to be benign. Because even though the malware authors are using all these weird and wonderful techniques and methodologies to try and evade us, there are some truths you can't escape from. There are some things that are always persistent. There are some things that you simply can't engineer your way around. And if we can find those things, we can give you a verdict back on the millisecond timescale. Okay, so we achieve that real-time kind of state that we want. regardless of what happens, if we convict it at that point, or if we are still unsure, we then send it to our dynamic environment. And inside that dynamic environment, there is something to the tune of, almost 1,000 individual things that are hooked into that environment, that are looking for very specific behaviors, looking for very specific techniques and processes that malware might create. We're simulating a real user, which is incredibly difficult to do. Inputting mouse clicks, inputting that randomness, trying to trick malware into running, adjusting the clock backwards and forwards. So to make sure that if that malware sample is trying to wait us out, that it doesn't get that opportunity to. And that's not just moving the clock by changing the time, that is actually accelerating and lying to the system how long it's actually been in reality. So we can do some interesting stuff like that. And we built it all on a custom hypervisor. The reason being is, we come back to those evasion techniques that is almost ubiquitous these days. If a malware sample realizes it's running in a virtual machine, it probably won't run, or it will only run under very specific circumstances. So what we're able to do is, by creating a custom hypervisor, is we can make it appear however we want it to be. We can make it look like it's a laptop. We can make it look like it's a server. It's a traditional desktop. We can do all this stuff. We can emulate any piece of hardware we want and really give it a perfect world to live in. And then what we also do is something that is brand new, because we've had this approach for about 15 years or so. But again, if we don't evolve with what the malware authors are doing, then we ourselves will become irrelevant over time. So we've had to keep innovating and keep moving forward. And we started to implement some of these new features, and we're going to dive into a couple of them later on. But things like malware family fingerprinting. So today we already group malware together by the campaign and the family it lives in, but we're now taking that step further. We're now going deeper into that with deeper attribution, deeper understanding of the context and the why as to how they're doing things. Automated unpacking. So recently we added the ability to take a lot of these unpacking utilities, and even ones we've never seen before, and unpack them before they actually execute. Okay, so we can compare both states of being, pre-packed and unpacked. We also do things with stealthy observation. So parallel to being inside of the VM, we'll also have another environment where we're running entirely outside of that dynamic environment. So we're looking at it from the outside in rather than the inside out. Okay, this gives us a unique set of abilities where there are some techniques you can't mask, you can't hide. And malware is now starting to look for those. But if we operate outside of the environment and we don't have those things loaded in it, then we can allow that malware to run, and it will run because those conditions won't be present. Okay, and that's what we call intelligent memory analysis. And then one of the more exciting things I think is dependency emulation. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. But either way, once all of this analysis is completed, we then send all those protections, all those preventions, all of that learning back to all the other services that we provide. We make them available through the API, and that goes into training the next generation of neural network environments that we have. Okay, so this whole environment gets smarter every 24 hours. As we see malware authors start to push new and unique things to us. So one of the more interesting things that we've seen recently is there was a particular malware campaign where we were seeing them submit their samples and their campaigns to us every couple of minutes. Sorry, and what we were seeing was every time they submitted, we would say it's malicious, and then they were turning things off in their campaign until essentially they just had a blank Windows application, and that blank Windows application would then run because it doesn't do anything malicious. And then we saw they would start to slowly turn things back on. They were trying to figure out exactly what combination of behaviors and techniques they were using would cause this environment to trigger and cause this environment to convict that sample. Okay, and we see this countless times. Every day we're seeing authors, send us thousands of different variations of their software to us to see at what point we stop saying something is malicious or not. Okay, and then they typically would then begin their attack in the real world. Now, this obviously doesn't work, right? Because we've already convicted that file, and we're also seeing that all those techniques being leveraged, has gone into teaching all these other services how these things work. Okay, and just to give you an idea of the scale around this, the learning that we have from analyzing a single sample will go on to prevent DNS queries. It will go on to prevent C2 connections. It will go on to prevent phishing sites or malware downloads on this sort of scale. We estimate in a 24-hour period, we'll block somewhere around 5 billion events a day. Okay, and then you start breaking that down into exploits and malware and DNS and so on. It's a remarkable amount of information we have that we then leverage everywhere else. Okay, so we talked about a little bit about how we do it and some of the more advanced stuff that we're doing. And this is where I think, the world is going. This is that future element, right? As malware changes, continues to evolve, we have to change with it. And this is only a small sample of what we're doing. There is a load more stuff to come. There's so many great ideas that the team have behind the scenes that are all in proof of concept stage or in final validation before they go out to market. But there's some really unique things in here that's been able to put us one step ahead of the malware authors, and truly remain one step ahead. And one of those, for example, is dependency emulation, which I think is really, really exciting because most malware has the simple goal of being able to run. Okay. And a lot of malware is now kind of tailored to look for very specific environments, look for very specific conditions to execute under. Now, what we can do here is we can say, if we look at this, this GIF that's playing, you see the user tries to execute the sample and the sample crashes because it's missing a certain library. Well, we can spot that and we can detect that, and then we can go give it what it wants. We can give it that perfect operating condition and that perfect operating environment that it's looking for so that it can run. Okay, because the sample that crashes is a sample that's utterly useless to us because we can't find anything interesting about it. Whereas if we allow it to run by giving it that perfect environment, we can then perform that analysis. We can then get all of that information that we need from it to then turn into preventions for all the other services, etc. And I think the most exciting feature that we've been able to pull off is this idea of configuration extraction. So truth be told, a lot of malware ships with some configuration element to it, whether that's a separate file, whether that's an externally hosted resource that they go and query and pull in, okay? And then that configuration then defines how this sample will run, how it will behave, all of that information. What's interesting is when we started analyzing a lot of these config files, we discovered that they contain, for example, a list of commands that they want to run, or, in this case, a lot of command and control servers that they can go and communicate to. So in a traditional sandbox, sample runs and say it connects to 4 command and control servers. Well, that's good, but we now know about 4. How many are there in reality? How many are we expecting? Well, we can't answer that question, whereas now we can. So if this sample here was to run and it only communicated to 4 of these different IPs listed, well, then we're missing all the others, right? They're not being inspected. They're not being caught up in that net. Well, now we can extract the config and we can see, oh, okay, you were actually configured to go talk to about 20 different command and control servers, and you're only ever selecting 4 at a time. Well, now we know about the whole 20, and we can convict the whole 20 in one go and go and pass them to individual services for analysis, right? So we can massively increase the scale and the scope of what we're able to capture and look at, and raise the efficacy and raise the relevance a lot more. And this is kind of where we are today. so sandboxes became a necessity because existing tooling couldn't deal with the rise in polymorphism and the size and the scale and the variability of malware. Current environments are really focused on looking for a handful of things, and they can be very easily evaded by most modern malware. And most modern malware is using techniques that were previously only in the hands of nation state and really well sponsored, really well organized groups. But now it's commodity. Now you can go and get a 0-day off GitHub, for example. It's trivially easy to defeat a lot of these environments. And as malware continues to evolve and continues to adopt new methodologies, new techniques, we have to evolve with it. And that's what we're doing with the advanced wildfire engine, and that's looking at things like dynamic memory analysis. That is performing inspection of the environment from the outside looking in. Okay. One of the key things we have is, we're one of the founding members of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a coalition between security vendors and governments and intelligence agencies. We have the highest number of what's called golden detections. And these are unique detections that are brand new, and the quality of them. Okay, so golden being the top tier quality, there is absolutely no room for doubt in there. We are leagues ahead of everybody else because of this unique approach that we have. Okay, and then once we do find something, that information is immediately released back to the world. Okay, there's no time delay necessarily in getting, from the moment a fire is convicted to that information being useful. Okay, we do it in real time. We do it in line in real time. Okay, that's the only way to provide this at scale. And that brings us back to this. You build a platform approach. You take all this intelligence. One simple file can actually populate every single service that we have with new and unique information that we then go and enumerate and perform additional analysis on. And that's all delivered in real time. So whether it be a firewall, whether it be a SASE platform, whether it to be cloud security, whether it to be endpoint, or if you want to take it and embed it in something custom through the API. Okay. And again, irrelevant whether it's devices, users, apps, or data, it's running absolutely everywhere. Okay. So it's incredibly important to think about this, in the role that this sandbox plays, because it seems like a humble piece of technology and it seems very quaint and it has its little corner and it has its own little function. But the implications of it and what it goes on to do and how it goes and scales other technologies is critically important. It really is the nucleus of everything we do and how we scale and how we are able to keep all these other services, up to date with the latest information. So thank you very, very much for listening to that. I will hand it now back to Chris to go through the quiz.
All right, thanks, Matt, and a brilliant overview of how sandboxing has evolved and how we need to move away from signature-based, pattern-based, and ML-based detections. There's been some really cool questions actually today, so thank you for everybody who submitted the questions. Hopefully the panel are getting across to all of them. We will send, obviously, when we make this content available, all the Q&A posted questions will be available in the replays as well. But that moves us on to calls to action. So there's a couple of things in the calls to action, but first things first, I'm going to extend this call a little bit for those of you that can stay on. I'm going to play a little video embedded into the presentation, which will show how advanced threat prevention and how advanced wildfire work together on the firewall. It's about 6 or 7 minutes, this video. So for those of you that could stay on, please do, please watch. If you cannot, but yet you want a deeper dive session, obviously get in contact and we can arrange a follow-up. So next slide, please, Matt. As for every week, the calls to action. So obviously you can try CDSS subscriptions, you can try Advanced Wildfire if you are an existing customer. If you're not an existing customer, we can run a ultimate test drive, which is hands-on training for you to get hands-on with the technology in a safe environment that is not your production network, and learn about the differences between how the different subscription services all work together to provide that enhanced level of security. Next slide, please, Matt. Okay, same thing as last week, actually. You know, we can run the security lifecycle review. We can put technology behind your existing technology, whether it be a Palo firewall running existing traditional threat prevention and advanced traditional wildfire. And we can show you the delta as to what we see. If it's another competitor's technology that you have out there, we can obviously put the firewall in there as well. We have the Beacon Learning Portal. So should you want to learn more about this technology and any of other products and services available from Palo Alto, you can register on there. It's totally free. You can consume and watch the online learning content. So I'd urge you to go and take a look at Beacon. Next slide, please, Matt. We have a survey, right? At the end, your feedback is a gift. We appreciate all of it. And if you would like a deeper dive, please let us know. We can arrange those sessions with the account teams local to where you are. We can arrange for people like Matt to come and talk to you about how good our wildfire product is, but also some deeper technology discussions. There were some really detailed questions that came up in the chat, which we can't really answer en masse, but we can definitely do so in a one-to-one session. Also, let us know any topics you'd like to cover in future sessions, so that when we end this series, we can evolve the series and we can include additional content. Okay, so next slide, please, Matt. So next week, next Wednesday morning, we have Alex Bachik. He's going to take a look at a DLP. So we're going to move away for a week, away from threat. We thought we'd give you a break on that. And we look at data leakage or data loss and how we do data loss prevention. It kind of relates to SaaS application security that we did a couple of weeks ago, and it rounds out the CASB offering that we have. But in order to break up the threat stuff, the following week, we'll be back into threat, and we'll be looking at URL filtering and DNS security and how they kind of coalesce as well around advanced threat and wildfire. So that's it for the presentation. We're now into the competition winners. So we've normalized the data set. Let's talk about that again. We made corrections to our own mistake, and so we have the true winners who answered the questions properly. So Matt, if you'd like to reveal third. Anthony H, congratulations, you came third out of everybody with the corrected questions. Number 2, Frederick A. Congratulations, Frederick. And then number 1, Pete Redmond. Congratulations, Peter. So we will try and find you in our database. It should be a bit easier this week, so because we have your names, you know, not called Vroom and Bush and things like that. So fingers crossed, we'll get that out to you. If you don't hear from us in a week or so, please let me know. And obviously my email address is available at the end of this presentation. So next slide, please, Matt. For those winners, you will receive an email a bit like this one. It is not phishing. For those of you that do not win, if you receive an email like this, it probably is phishing. So treat with caution. But for those of you just put on the screen, you should be safe. And also in the previous weeks as well. Okay, next slide, please, Matt. All right, I will fire up the Menti quiz right now. If you want to just stop sharing, Matt, I will take control. Share screen. Okay, brilliant. So now you should see the QR code to sign into Menti. If you guys through the chat function can let me know whether you are accessing the Menti website, I will leave this QR code up for another minute or so to make sure that you can all scan it and get access to the quiz. Now, fingers crossed, this will go well today. Okay, we have 39 people in. I'll just leave it up for a little while longer. 44 still joining. 50, I think that's the most we've had in the quiz so far. Brilliant. Okay, 52. What's the chat? By the way, I should have said, if you're joining the quiz, please can you join with your first name, last name, so we can identify you. And also, Palo people, please do not participate. If you are a Palo Alto person, please do not vote in this quiz, because then I've got to go dig you out and do some maths on or we do some sums on the scorecard to figure out who's who in the zoo. Okay, all right. Another 30 seconds, then we'll get into it. Okay. About 15 seconds. Still a couple of stragglers joining in late. Okay, let's get on with it. Let's go. All right, let's see. I'm going to start this quiz. We have a lot of people on today, 64, which is fantastic. 65, still coming in. Awesome. We have to go, otherwise we will run massively over time. So answer fast, get points. Question 1, which is not one of the reasons to buy traditional sandboxing? So misleading, confusing question. Double not. Excellent. 25, you got that one right. Only detects no threats. You are right. Traditional sandboxing does not work. Okay, let's see how we stand on that one. Doritheos. Very cool. Very cool. Cosmin and Chris Lim as well. Not far behind. Okay, next question. Everybody on. Choose the feature that's part of both wildfire and advanced wildfire. That's an interesting one. I have to be paying close attention to get this one right.
Chris, you would have known the answer, right?
Many, many moons ago. All right, correct. Machine learning, 38 of you getting that one right. So dependency emulation, malware family fingerprinting, configuration analysis is all part of advanced wildfire. Okay, let's see what that does to the leaderboard. Dorotheos still leading the charge, and Chris Lim not far behind. EA. Oh no, Even moving up to 3rd. I'm not sure who EA is. We'll try and hunt you down if you're successful in the end. Okay, question 3. Going well, motoring along. Advanced wildfire analysis malware configuration data in real time and creates signatures for only the affected customer only. True or false? So Matt talked about this towards the end of his presentation. It's a really, really cool feature and something pretty unique to what we do. Excellent. Correct. It is for all customers, and we update all customers in real time. Well done to 37 of you there. Okay. Oh, Chris Lim going quick on that one. And Doritheos still at the top, though, I think. Chris Lim takes top spot. Phenomenal. And Even moving up. Doritheos has got some work to do. Okay, number 4. Okay, here we go. Right on time. What is the core component of a machine learning, deep learning based solution which ensures a low number of false positives? It's a good question. What do you like that? Matt, or was that you, Stefania? You're still not voted, still not sure. Okay, time's up. So yeah, you're right. Data quality is everything in machine learning and deep learning. Obviously, machine learning, we have to tag the data, which is a manual process, and we have to say whether it's good or it's bad. Deep learning takes the data and it makes its own decisions in multiple dimensions as well, and it updates itself in real time. So, yep, data quality is absolutely key, and this is why at Palo Alto Networks we are in a great place, because we've been collecting data for such a long time from such a large number of customers. Okay, let's have a look at the leaderboard. Okay, tie between Chris Lim and Even. Bilal coming up into 3rd. Excellent stuff. Okay, last question. 54 of you still on playing the quiz, which is great to see. Based on customer requirements, Wildfire can run malware analysis where? On-prem in the cloud, public cloud, or private cloud? Excellent, good job. 44 of you knowing that we have an on-premise solution as well, albeit we can't run all of the advanced Wildfire capabilities, but it still can sandbox malware. It's great for air-gapped networks. So let's look at the leaderboard. Actually, let's not look at the leaderboard. This is question 5. We don't want to give this away. We will be announcing the winners next week on the next call. So it's now 10:02. I've got a little demo for those of you that can stay on. I can't see how many people are still on the call.
We still got lots of people, so it looks like we got
All
time
right.
for it.
Phenomenal. Look, let's get onto the demo. It's just a short video, 6 minutes long, and it will just kind of show you a little bit of how these things work and the detections and the visibility that we get. If I can find my Zoom window.
Yeah, I like this video because it really kind of it starts to tie the whole story together, right? We talked advanced threat prevention last week. We talked advanced wildfire here. You've got different capabilities.
All right, so this is where we find out whether noise sound sharing actually works. But if not, you can still get the gist of this through the video. So it could either be a silent 6 minutes, or it could be one that's pretty well annotated. So away we go.
In this demo, we are going to exploit Bitbucket and deliver Cobalt Strike command and control malware. We are going to do this in multiple attacks, each getting more and more sophisticated to demonstrate to you the power of inline deep learning versus just traditional signature controls. Here's the attacker's system. They've staged a Cobalt Strike team server using a standard profile and are going to look for an attack vector. We see the Bitbucket server is running version 7.21.3, a long-term support version of the software that is vulnerable to the exploit mentioned a moment ago. The attacker attempts the published exploit. We see at the bottom of the output, connection reset by peer. This is likely a block by an inline security control. Pivoting to the firewall, we see the exploit attempt blocked by the signature written for the known exploit. Now, the attacker will run a modified version of the exploit. This time, the attack appears successful, but there's still no connection back in the C2 tool. Over on the firewall, the data filtering logs show the malware file being downloaded. In the threat logs, there is no evidence of the exploit, but we do see the malware detected by MLAV, as well as the Cobalt Strike beacon traffic being detected and blocked as Cobalt Strike beacon command and control traffic detection. Now, for the final option, the attacker restarts Cobalt Strike with a crafted, malleable profile designed to emulate real-world traffic. Executing the crafted exploit again, the attacker sees a connection back in Cobalt Strike and can continue their nefarious deeds, spawning child processes and even getting a hash dump of the passwords on the Windows system. Now, let's enable inline cloud analysis for vulnerabilities new in PAN-OS 11.0. Configuring it is part of the vulnerability protection profiles. We see here a new tab for inline cloud analysis with a checkbox to enable the service and expected actions for each of the 2 deep learning models. Let's enable it for this profile in alert only. Inline cloud analysis for command and control is part of the anti-spyware profiles. We see here a new tab for inline cloud analysis with a checkbox to enable the service and the expected actions for each of the deep learning models. Let's also enable this one in alert only mode. And now we're ready to try that attack again. In the threat logs, we see the exploit detected by inline cloud analyzed command injection. The malware is detected by MLAV, and the C2 traffic detected by MLC2 as inline cloud analyzed HTTP C2 traffic. With the profiles set to reset bulk, we would have seen the attacks and blocked them in real time. That's the power of inline deep learning, being able to detect and block unknown or highly evasive attacks. In addition to the reporting and logs on the firewall, the Threat Vault API can be used by security operations folks to integrate directly into their tools and investigations, providing easy access to details around inline cloud analysis verdicts. For each cloud analyzed verdict, there is a corresponding cloud report ID. Using that ID, we can query the API. In this example, I'm using the Threat Vault Python library. Here's the JSON output of the cloud report that includes all the relevant information, such as details on the firewall, source destination, and the process payload. The Threat Vault API also has the ability to deliver PCAPs of the analyzed traffic using the same cloud report ID. By default, the file is saved with the report ID .pcap. You can then use your PCAP reader of choice to view the details of the traffic.
Sorry, Tim, I think you lost it towards the end. Is that right?
No, it kept working there.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. So basically, that demo shows you, and thank you 93 people for staying on to watch that demo, shows you how these things all work together to prevent successful cyber attacks, but it also shows you the complexity of cyber attacks and how many different tools and techniques attackers are putting together to exploit and compromise machines. And Cobalt Strike and Malleable C2 is incredibly difficult to spot, and it's something that's pretty unique to how we detect. With that, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Next week, we'll be joined by our resident cybersecurity guru, Mr. John Harrison. So he'll be hosting you next week, I think. Is that right, John? You're right next week?
I think so.
Cool. And then, yeah, we will be covering DLP with Alex Batchik. So I'm really looking forward to that session. Thank you so much for staying on. Thank you for participating in the quiz. Thank you for all your excellent questions. They have really tested the panel. It's great to see such interactivity. This really sparked some great debates. If you want to follow up with us, please fill out the survey and we will be in touch. Thank you so much.